first time he walked through the tall iron gates of the elite school, he felt as if he had stepped into a different world. The buildings were wide and bright, made of polished stone that reflected the morning sun. Students stood in small groups, laughing easily, wearing neat uniforms that looked new and perfectly fitted. Expensive cars lined the entrance road, dropping off boys and girls who carried shiny backpacks and spoke about piano lessons in Europe and summer trips abroad. He stood still for a moment, holding the strap of his worn bag. His shoes were clean but old. His blazer had been donated, and the sleeves were slightly too long. He pulled them back quietly and began walking toward the main building. He had learned long ago how to walk without drawing attention, how to take up as little space as possible. He had lived in 3 different foster homes in the past 5 years. None of them were cruel, but none of them were permanent either. He had learned not to get too comfortable. Every time he unpacked his small suitcase, he told himself it might not be for long. The only thing that stayed constant in his life was music. In every house, no matter how small, he would search for a keyboard, an old piano, or even a music app on a phone. When everything else felt uncertain, the keys under his fingers felt steady. On his first day at the new school, he noticed something else besides the big buildings and expensive cars. There was a music hall, larger than any he had seen before. Through its glass doors, he could see a grand piano sitting in the center of the room, black and shining like a mirror. His heart beat faster just looking at it. He almost didn't apply to this school. His foster mother had filled out the scholarship forms after a teacher from his previous school noticed his talent during a small local event. When the acceptance letter arrived, he read it 3 times before believing it was real. A full scholarship, tuition covered, access to every program, a chance to study in a place known for excellence. Still, as he stood in the hallway that first week, he felt the weight of invisible eyes. Some students glanced at him and then quickly looked away. Others whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. It wasn't loud or direct. It was softer than that, the kind of quiet judgment that hangs in the air. He kept his head down and focused on his classes. He answered questions when called on. He took careful notes. During lunch, he usually sat at the end of a table or sometimes outside on a bench under a large tree. He didn't complain. He had learned that silence was safer. 2 weeks after school started, an announcement echoed through the speakers. The annual piano competition would take place at the end of the term. It was the school's biggest event. Parents, guests, and even local reporters would attend. Winners often received special recognition and sometimes invitations to perform at larger events. Excitement spread quickly. Students in the advanced music program talked about it nonstop. Some had private instructors who visited their homes. Others had been playing since they were 4 years old. They discussed difficult compositions as if they were simple games. He listened quietly from his seat in music class. His fingers rested lightly on the desk, moving slightly as if playing invisible keys. The teacher explained that anyone could audition to participate. The final performers would be selected after a preliminary round. Anyone. The word stayed in his mind the entire day. That afternoon, instead of going straight home, he walked to the music hall. The door was open. A few students were practicing, their pieces flowing confidently through the room. He stood near the back wall, listening carefully. He didn't feel jealous. He felt alive. When the room became empty, he walked toward the sign-up sheet placed on a small table near the entrance. Several names were already written in neat handwriting. He hesitated for only a second before adding his own. The next morning, whispers began. Some students recognized his name from the scholarship announcement made earlier that month. A foster child. A charity case, one boy muttered under his breath. Others raised their eyebrows in surprise. He could almost hear their thoughts. Does he really think he can compete with us? During practice sessions, he noticed something else. While most of the main competitors practiced on the grand piano in the center of the hall, he was directed toward a different room for rehearsal. It wasn't as large or as bright. In the corner stood an older upright piano. Its surface was polished, but the keys felt slightly stiff. When he pressed one of them, the sound came out a little sharp. Another key felt heavier than the rest. He frowned slightly but continued playing. Maybe it just needed warming up. Over the next few days, he returned to that same piano. Each time, he noticed small imperfections. Some notes were softer than they should be. One key stuck for half a second before rising again. It wasn't broken exactly. It was just off. He mentioned it politely to one of the students who seemed to organize the practice schedule. The boy shrugged and said it was fine. "It works, doesn't it?" He replied with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. He understood the message. Don't complain. So he didn't. Instead, he stayed after everyone left. He played scales slowly, testing each key. He adjusted his pressure. He memorized which notes needed a lighter touch and which needed more force. If the piano was uneven, he would become even steadier. At home, his foster mother noticed he was quieter than usual. She asked if everything was all right. He nodded and said school was good. He didn't want to worry her. She worked long hours and still found time to attend every small performance he ever had. He knew how proud she was that he got into this school. Late at night, when the house was silent, he would close his eyes and imagine playing on a perfect piano. In his mind, every note sounded clear and balanced. Then he would picture the old upright from the practice room and imagine himself mastering it. He told himself that music was not about perfect instruments. It was about feeling. Back at school, the list of competitors grew shorter after the first selection round. His name remained on it. A few students seemed surprised. One even looked annoyed. During a group rehearsal, he overheard two boys speaking near the doorway. "Let's see how far he gets," one of them said quietly. "He won't last," the other replied. "This isn't some small-town recital." He pretended not to hear, but their words followed him the entire day. That evening, when he returned to the small practice room, he ran his fingers over the keys more gently than before. He didn't feel angry. He felt focused. Every time a note sounded slightly wrong, he corrected himself. Every time a key resisted, he pressed it with calm patience. He began to notice something interesting. The piano's flaws forced him to listen more carefully. He couldn't rely on the instrument to do the work for him. He had to control every sound. It was harder, but it also made him sharper. One afternoon, as he finished practicing, he caught a glimpse of the grand piano in the main hall. For a moment, he imagined himself sitting there during the competition, lights shining, audience silent. Instead of fear, he felt a quiet fire inside him. He knew he didn't have what the others had. He didn't have years of expensive training. He didn't have parents who could call private tutors. He didn't even have his own piano at home. But he had something else. He had learned how to keep going when things were not fair. He had learned how to adjust when life changed without warning. He had learned how to find stability in the middle of uncertainty. As the competition day drew closer, the whispers grew louder, but so did his determination. He no longer felt like he was standing outside the gates, looking in. He felt like he was preparing for something bigger than a trophy. He didn't want to prove the others wrong. He wanted to prove to himself that no matter where he came from, no matter what instrument he was given, he could still create something beautiful. And in the quiet practice room, with the stiff keys under his fingers, he kept playing. The days after the first selection round felt different. The hallway conversations grew sharper, quieter, and more focused. Only a small number of students remained in the competition now, and everyone knew who the strongest players were supposed to be. His name still being on the list made some people uncomfortable. He could feel it. In music class, when the teacher spoke about interpretation and emotional control, a few students would glance at him and then quickly look away. It was not open bullying. It was something colder than that. It was the kind of silence that says, "You are not one of us." The practice schedule changed the following week. A printed sheet was placed outside the music hall with assigned time slots. The most experienced students were given long hours in the main auditorium with the grand piano. He scanned the list slowly until he found his name. Practice Room B. Late evenings. He already knew what that meant. Practice Room B was the small room at the end of the corridor. The one with the older upright piano. He told himself it didn't matter. Piano was still a piano. That evening, He walked down the narrow hallway toward the room. The lights above flickered slightly. When he pushed the door open, he noticed something immediately. The piano lid was closed, and a thin layer of dust rested on the top. It looked as if no one had touched it since his last session. He wiped the surface gently with his sleeve and sat down. The first chord sounded worse than before. He paused. One of the middle keys gave off a dull sound, almost flat. Another note rang slightly sharper than it should have. He pressed them again, hoping it was his imagination. It wasn't. He leaned closer, pressing each key slowly, listening carefully. 2 more notes felt heavier than before, as if something inside was resisting. He sat back and took a slow breath. It wasn't an accident. The piano had been adjusted. Not enough to make it completely unplayable. Just enough to make it difficult. He remembered the small smiles in the hallway, the quiet whispers, the way the schedule had been arranged. For a brief moment his hands trembled. Not because he couldn't play on it, but because he understood the message clearly now. They wanted him to struggle. They wanted him to doubt himself. He stared at the uneven keys, and a heavy silence filled the room. He could have walked out. He could have complained to a teacher. He could have asked for equal access to the main hall. But he didn't. Instead, he placed his fingers back on the keyboard. He started with scales slowly and carefully. The uneven notes interrupted the smooth flow, forcing him to adjust his pressure. When a key responded too sharply, he softened his touch. When one felt weak, he pressed deeper. After 20 minutes, his frustration began to fade. His focus grew sharper. If the piano was going to be difficult, he would become more precise. The next day at school, he noticed something else. A group of students stood near the practice hallway during his scheduled time. They weren't inside the room. They were just close enough to hear. He understood. They were waiting to hear mistakes. He entered the room without looking at them and closed the door. For a second, he could hear faint laughter outside. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. He sat down and began playing his competition piece from the beginning. The opening notes were soft and controlled. The middle section required quick movement across the keys. This was where the piano's flaws were most noticeable. The stiff key slowed his finger slightly. He corrected it. A sharp note threatened to throw off the melody. He adjusted his touch instantly. Outside, the hallway grew quiet. He continued playing, not perfectly but steadily. By the time he reached the final section, he felt something change inside him. The piano was no longer an enemy. It was a challenge. When he finished, there was no laughter outside the door. Just silence. He waited a moment before opening it. The hallway was empty. That night at home, his foster mother noticed the small crease between his eyebrows. "Long practice?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Hard piece." He hesitated, then said, "Hard piano." She looked at him carefully but did not push for details. Instead, she poured him a glass of water and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes people test you without saying they are testing you." He looked up. "Not because they are strong," she continued, "but because they are unsure." He didn't respond right away, but her words stayed with him. The following afternoon, something unexpected happened. As he entered practice room B, he found 2 students already inside. They were standing near the piano, whispering. They stopped when they saw him. "Oh," one of them said casually. "You're early." This was his assigned time. He nodded and waited. They didn't move immediately. One of them pressed a few keys randomly, creating uneven sounds. The other laughed softly. After a moment, they stepped aside and walked past him toward the door. "Good luck," one of them said in a tone that felt more like a challenge than encouragement. When they left, he sat down again. The piano felt even more unstable than the day before. He closed his eyes. Instead of anger, he focused on something else. The feeling he had the first time he saw the grand piano in the main hall. The quiet fire inside him. He began practicing again, slower this time. He broke the piece into small sections. He repeated difficult passages until his fingers knew exactly how to respond to the piano's flaws. The more he practiced on the uneven instrument, the stronger his control became. His ears grew more sensitive. He could hear the smallest change in tone. He could feel the slightest resistance in the keys. Days passed. Rumors began to circulate quietly that he was still improving. One student who had passed by the practice room mentioned that he sounded surprisingly steady. Another admitted that he didn't seem as affected by the piano as expected. But no one apologized. No one offered him the main hall. He didn't ask. One evening, as he finished a full run-through of his piece, the music teacher happened to walk by. The door had been slightly open, and the teacher paused to listen. When he finished, he turned and noticed the teacher standing there. "That piano can be difficult," the teacher said thoughtfully. He nodded politely. "You handle it well," the teacher added before walking away. It wasn't praise filled with excitement. It was simple and honest. But it meant something. The next day, the final rehearsal schedule was posted. Each competitor would perform once on the main stage before competition day to adjust to the grand piano. His slot was the last one. Some students rolled their eyes when they saw it. Others smirked. He didn't react. When his turn finally arrived, he walked into the large auditorium. The lights were dim, but the grand piano stood in the center, polished and perfect. For a moment he simply looked at it. Then he sat down. His fingers touched the keys gently. The sound that came out was clear, balanced, smooth, felt almost too easy. After weeks of adjusting to stiffness and uneven tones, this piano responded like water under his hands. Every note flowed naturally. He began playing his piece. Without the resistance of the old upright, his movements felt lighter, freer. The music rose into the empty auditorium, filling the space. When he finished, the room was silent. A few students who had stayed to watch looked confused. They had expected struggle. Instead, they saw control. As he stood up from the bench, he understood something clearly. The fixed piano had not weakened him. It had trained him. And if the plan had been to make him doubt himself, it had done the opposite. It had made him stronger. After the final rehearsal on the grand piano, something shifted in the air around him. It was not loud or dramatic. No one suddenly became friendly. No one walked up to congratulate him. But the smirks were gone. The confident whispers had turned into quiet conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He could feel it. For weeks, people had expected him to struggle. They had waited for missed notes, shaky hands, signs that he did not belong. Instead, he had played with calm control. Not perfectly, but honestly. And honesty carried weight. Still, the competition was only 3 days away. Those 3 days felt longer than all the weeks before. He continued practicing in the small room with the old upright piano. Even though he had touched the grand piano and knew how smooth it felt, he chose to return to the uneven keys. He did not want comfort to make him careless. When he pressed the stiff middle key again, he no longer felt frustration. He felt familiarity. The flaws that once felt like traps now felt like teachers. They had trained his fingers to think before moving. They had trained his ears to listen deeper. One afternoon, while he was practicing the most difficult section of his piece, he heard the door creak slightly. He thought it might be another student coming to watch quietly. But when he turned his head, he saw the music teacher standing near the back wall. The teacher did not interrupt. He simply listened. The room was small, so every sound felt close and personal. When the sharp note rang slightly higher than expected, he softened the next chord to balance it. When the heavy key slowed him down, he adjusted his rhythm gently. When he finished, the teacher stepped forward. "You don't fight the instrument," the teacher said calmly. "You work with it." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "That's rare," the teacher added, then left the room. He sat there for a moment after the door closed. Those simple words meant more than loud praise. They meant someone had noticed the effort behind the sound. At home that evening, his foster mother was folding laundry on the couch, while the television played softly in the background. He sat on the floor with his sheet music spread in front of him. He traced the notes with his finger, not playing, just imagining. "You're thinking hard," she said with a small smile. He looked up. "I keep hearing the stiff key in my head." She laughed gently. "That piano has become famous in this house." He smiled for the first time that day. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He thought about it carefully before answering. "A little, but not about playing." "Then what?" He hesitated. "About what people expect." She put the folded towel aside and looked at him directly. "People will always expect something," she said. "Sometimes they expect you to fail. Sometimes they expect you to succeed. But none of that changes what your hands can do." He let her words settle in his mind. That night, he lay awake longer than usual. He wasn't afraid of forgetting the music. He had practiced it so many times that it felt like breathing. What stayed in his mind were the faces in the hallway, the quiet judgments, the feeling of being measured before he even touched the keys. He realized something important in the darkness of his room. He had spent most of his life being measured by social workers, by new families, by teachers who read his file before meeting him. He was used to people deciding who he was before he spoke. But music was different. Music did not ask about his background. It did not care about scholarships or foster records. It only responded to touch, timing, feeling. And that was something no one could take from him. The day before the competition, the school felt tense. Posters were placed on the walls announcing the event. Chairs were arranged in the auditorium. Students walked around holding sheet music, humming quietly to themselves. He passed by a group of competitors discussing their pieces in detail. They spoke about technique and tempo, about impressing the judges with speed and complexity. He listened but did not join. His focus was simpler. He wanted to tell a story through his playing. A story of quiet rooms, of moving boxes, of late nights practicing on borrowed instruments. A story without words. In the afternoon, he had one final rehearsal on the grand piano. The auditorium lights were brighter this time. A few teachers sat scattered in the seats, taking notes. He walked to the center stage calmly. When he sat down, he took one deep breath. The first note rang clear and steady. This time, he didn't think about the stiff keys. He didn't think about the whispers. He didn't think about winning. He thought about the small living rooms where he had practiced before. The old keyboards with missing stickers. The quiet encouragement from his foster mother when he doubted himself. The music flowed more naturally than ever before. When he reached the most challenging passage, his fingers moved confidently. Weeks of adjusting to the uneven upright had strengthened his control. The grand piano felt like open space. He finished softly, letting the last note fade completely before lifting his hands. There was no applause during rehearsal, but he noticed something different in the room. The teachers were not writing immediately. They were looking at him, not as a scholarship student, not as a foster child, as a musician. He stepped off the stage quietly and returned home early that day. He did not practice again that evening. Instead, he sat with his foster mother at the kitchen table and helped her prepare dinner. "You're not practicing?" she asked. "I think I've done enough," he replied. She studied his face for a moment and saw something steady there. "Then rest," she said. That night, he slept peacefully. Competition day arrived with clear skies and a cold breeze. The school looked different with cars filling the parking area and guests walking through the gates in formal clothes. The auditorium lights glowed warmly through the windows. He arrived early, wearing his neatly pressed uniform. It was the same blazer with slightly long sleeves, but this time he didn't adjust them nervously. Backstage, the competitors waited in silence. Some stretched their fingers repeatedly. Others closed their eyes and whispered to themselves. He sat quietly on a bench, hands resting on his knees. One student glanced at him and then looked away quickly. There was no smirk this time, only uncertainty. He realized then that something had changed. It wasn't that he had become louder or more confident in appearance. It was that he no longer looked unsure. When his name was called for a brief sound check before the audience entered, he walked to the stage again. The empty auditorium felt peaceful. He pressed a few keys gently. Perfect balance. No stiffness. No sharp surprises. He smiled slightly. The weeks with the fixed piano had prepared him for worse. This felt like a gift. As he stepped off the stage, he felt calm in a way he had never felt before a performance. Not because he was certain of winning, but because he was certain of himself. Backstage, the audience began filling the seats. Voices blended into a soft hum. Programs rustled. Cameras clicked quietly. He closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered the small practice room. He remembered the stiff keys. He remembered choosing not to complain. And he understood something clearly. No matter what happened in the next few hours, he had already grown stronger than he had been at the beginning of this journey. The competition was no longer just about proving others wrong. It was about honoring the quiet strength he had built in rooms where no one clapped. When the lights dimmed and the announcer stepped forward to welcome the guests, he felt his heartbeat steady, not racing. He opened his eyes. It was time. It looks like you meant part 4, since part 3 is already written. I'll continue the story naturally from where it left off. Here is part 4, around 1,400 words, written in simple, natural, human-centered language. When the lights dimmed and the announcer stepped forward, the entire auditorium grew quiet. The soft hum of conversation faded into stillness. The competition had officially begun. He sat backstage, listening to the first performer walk onto the stage. Applause followed. Then music filled the hall, fast, impressive, technically perfect. The audience responded warmly when it ended. He did not compare. He did not count mistakes. He simply listened. One by one, students performed. Some played with great speed. Some played with dramatic movements, lifting their hands high before striking the keys again. A few stumbled slightly but recovered quickly. Backstage, tension slowly grew heavier. When his name was finally called, it felt almost unreal. For a brief second, he remained seated. Then he stood up. The walk from backstage to the piano felt longer than usual. The bright lights made it difficult to see individual faces in the crowd, but he could sense the room was full. Parents, teachers, special guests, all watching. Now, with a perfectly tuned instrument under his fingers, the sound felt rich and alive. The audience leaned in without realizing it. As he moved into the second section, the tempo increased. His fingers traveled across the keys smoothly. There was no stiffness now, no resistance. But his touch remained careful, precise, shaped by every difficult practice session in the small room. Somewhere in the audience, a few students who had doubted him sat up straighter. He did not look at them. He focused only on the music. The most challenging passage approached, the part that had once been hardest to control on the fixed piano. Weeks ago, the uneven keys had forced him to slow down and rebuild the rhythm carefully. Now, when he reached that section, his fingers moved confidently. Every note landed cleanly. The melody rose higher, stronger, fuller. The sound filled the entire hall. There was something different about his playing. It was not flashy. It was not aggressive. It was honest. Each phrase carried emotion that felt real, not practiced for applause. Halfway through the piece, he stopped thinking about the judges. He stopped thinking about winning. He remembered the first time he touched a piano in a foster home living room. The instrument had been old and slightly out of tune, but he had felt wonder instead of disappointment. That same feeling returned now. The final section approached. It began softly, almost like a whisper. His hands moved gently, carefully shaping the ending. The auditorium felt completely still. No coughing, no shifting in seats, just listening. The music grew slightly stronger, then softened again. He allowed the final notes to linger, holding the last chord just long enough before slowly lifting his fingers. Silence. For one long second, there was no reaction at all. Then applause erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was strong, warm, genuine. Some people even stood up. He blinked slightly, surprised by the intensity of it. He stood and gave a small bow, his face calm but his chest tight with emotion. As he walked off stage, he did not look toward the students who had once smirked. He did not search for their reaction. Backstage, he sat down quietly again. His hands trembled slightly now that it was over. Not from fear, from release. One of the staff members passed by and gave him a quick nod of respect. "You played beautifully," she whispered. He thanked her softly. The remaining performers went on stage, but something had shifted in the energy of the room. The audience listened more carefully now, as if measuring each performance against the standard that had just been set. He did not think of it that way. He simply felt relieved. After the final competitor finished, all participants were called to the stage. They stood in a line, facing the audience. The judges whispered among themselves at a table near the front. The wait felt endless. He stared at the stage floor, not wanting to build expectations. He told himself that no matter what happened next, he had done what he came to do. He had played with honesty. He had given everything he had practiced for. The announcer stepped forward again, holding an envelope. Third place, the announcer began. A name was called. Applause followed. The student stepped forward proudly. Second place. Another name. Louder applause. His heartbeat grew slightly faster now. And first place. The room felt suspended in silence. His name echoed through the auditorium. For a second, he thought he had misheard. Then the applause began again, even louder than before. He stood still, almost frozen, until one of the teachers gently nudged him forward. He stepped toward the center of the stage as the trophy was handed to him. It wasn't large or flashy, just polished and simple, but it felt heavy in his hands. He looked out into the audience. In the third row, he saw his foster mother standing with tears in her eyes, clapping harder than anyone else. That sight meant more than the trophy. As the applause continued, he allowed himself a small smile. Not proud, not arrogant, just grateful. When the ceremony ended and students began leaving the stage, something unexpected happened. One of the boys who had once stood outside the practice room approached him slowly. "You played really well," the boy said, avoiding direct eye contact. "Thank you," he replied calmly. There was an awkward pause. "That old piano in practice room B." The boy began, then stopped. He simply nodded. The boy swallowed and said quietly, "It didn't make it harder for you." He looked at him and answered honestly, "It did." The boy looked surprised. "But it helped too." There was nothing more to say after that. As the crowd slowly emptied and families gathered near the stage for photos, he stepped down carefully, still holding the trophy. His foster mother wrapped him in a tight hug. "I knew it," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "I just played." She pulled back and looked at him. "No," she said softly. "You grew." He understood what she meant. This victory was not just about winning first place. It was about standing on a stage where he once felt invisible and being seen, not as a foster kid, not as a scholarship student, but as someone who had turned difficulty into strength. As they walked out of the auditorium together, the evening air felt cool and fresh. For the first time since arriving at the elite school, he did not feel like he was walking through someone else's world. He felt like he belonged. The night after the competition did not feel loud or dramatic. There were no fireworks, no grand celebration waiting at home, just a quiet car ride back through familiar streets, the trophy resting carefully on his lap. He kept looking down at it, almost as if it might disappear. His foster mother drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near him. Every few minutes, she glanced over and smiled. "You're very quiet," she said gently. "I'm just thinking," he replied. "About what?" He paused. "About how strange it feels." "Strange how?" He looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "For so long, I felt like I had to prove I deserved to be there. And now, I don't know." She understood without him finishing the sentence. When they reached home, she made tea and placed the trophy carefully in the center of the small dining table. It looked almost too fancy for the room. The table had tiny scratches from years of use. The walls were simple and plain, but somehow the trophy didn't look out of place. It looked earned. The next morning, school felt different. As he walked through the gates, a few students glanced at him and quickly looked away. Not with judgment this time, with curiosity, even uncertainty. He wasn't used to being noticed. Inside the hallway, conversations lowered slightly as he passed. Not because people were whispering about him in a negative way, but because they weren't sure what to say. One student approached him near the lockers. "Congratulations," the student said awkwardly. "Thank you," he replied politely. Another nodded at him in the corridor. A small gesture, but it meant something. In music class, the teacher began by speaking about the competition. He mentioned the overall quality, the discipline shown by the performers, and the importance of dedication. Then he looked directly at him. "Sometimes," the teacher said calmly, "talent grows strongest under pressure." There was no need to explain further. The room was quiet. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. The school principal announced that the winning performance would be shared during the upcoming school assembly. A recording had been taken during the competition. It would be played for the entire student body. When he heard that, his stomach tightened slightly. It was one thing to perform once. It was another to have everyone watch it again. During lunch, he sat outside under the large tree like he often did. The winter air was cool but not harsh. He held a small notebook in his hands, though he wasn't writing anything. He was thinking. Winning had not erased the past few weeks. It had not erased the looks in the hallway or the memory of the fixed piano in the small room. But something inside him had changed. He no longer felt small. The next day, the assembly hall filled quickly. Students from every grade found seats. Teachers stood along the walls. The large screen at the front was prepared for the recording. He sat near the middle, not at the front. When the video began, a quiet wave of murmurs moved through the room. There he was on the screen, walking toward the piano. Calm, focused. Watching himself felt strange. He noticed small things, the way he adjusted the bench slightly, the way he paused before the first note. When the music began playing through the speakers, the room slowly grew silent. Even students who had not attended the competition now listened carefully. The sound of the grand piano filled the hall again, strong and clear. As the recording reached the most difficult section, he heard someone behind him whisper, "That part is really hard." He did not turn around. When the final note faded in the video, the hall remained quiet for a second, just like it had during the real performance. Then applause spread across the room. Not forced, not polite, real. He felt heat rise in his face. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. Felt earned. After the assembly, something even more surprising happened. The principal announced that the music department would be reviewing all instruments in the practice rooms to ensure equal quality for every student. The message was clear without naming anyone. Some students shifted in their seats. He did not smile. He did not react. He simply felt relief. Later that week, he walked past practice room B and noticed the door was open. Inside, a technician was adjusting the upright piano. The stiff keys were being carefully removed and replaced. The tuning tools lay neatly on top. He stood quietly at the doorway. The technician looked up and smiled. "This one had a few issues," he said casually. "Should be good as new soon." He nodded. Good as new. For a moment, he stepped inside and ran his fingers gently across the repaired keys. The notes sounded balanced now. Even. Smooth. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt happy that future students would not struggle unnecessarily. Another part of him felt grateful for the way it had once been. That flawed piano had shaped him. It had forced him to listen more deeply. It had made him stronger. As the days passed, something else began to happen. A few younger students approached him after school, asking simple questions. How do you stay calm before performing? How do you practice difficult parts? He answered honestly. I slow down. I listen carefully. I don't rush. He didn't speak like a champion giving advice. He spoke like someone who had learned through trial. One afternoon, while leaving the music hall, he noticed one of the students who had once stood outside the practice room during those early days. The student walked up slowly. I wanted to say something, he began, looking uncomfortable. About before. He waited. I shouldn't have. The student stopped, struggling to find the right words. It wasn't fair. He studied the student's face carefully. There was no sarcasm now, only sincerity. It's okay, he replied quietly. The student looked surprised. "You're not angry?" He thought about it. "I was," he admitted. "But not anymore." The student nodded slowly. Sometimes growth does not require long speeches. Just small, honest moments. At home, the trophy found a permanent place on a small shelf near the window. It caught the sunlight in the mornings, reflecting tiny beams across the wall. His foster mother often paused and looked at it with pride. But she noticed something else too. He practiced the same way he always had. He didn't become arrogant. He didn't demand better treatment. He simply continued working. One evening, she asked him gently, "What do you want next?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I want to get better," he said simply. "Not famous. Not recognized. Better." That answer made her smile more than the trophy ever could. At school, the atmosphere had settled. The excitement of the competition faded into normal routine. Homework returned. Exams approached. Conversations shifted to other topics. But the quiet respect remained. He no longer felt like someone walking carefully along the edges of a room. He felt steady. And sometimes, when he passed the music hall and saw the grand piano resting under the soft lights, he remembered the small, stiff keys in the old practice room. He remembered choosing not to give up. He remembered choosing to adjust instead of complain. And he understood something clearly now. The victory was not just the moment his name was called. It was every evening he stayed behind in that small room. It was every time he pressed a difficult key again instead of walking away. It was every choice to respond with patience instead of anger. The competition had ended, but the strength he had built would stay. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The weeks after the competition passed quietly, but something deeper was changing beneath the surface. First, everything seemed normal again. Classes continued. Homework piled up. The hallway noise returned to its usual level. But every now and then, someone would stop him to talk about the performance. Not in a dramatic way, just small comments. "I watched the recording again," one student said during lunch. "I didn't notice how soft the ending was the first time." Another asked him if he could help with a difficult section of a new piece. He still felt surprised every time someone asked for advice. One afternoon, the music teacher stopped him after class. "There's a small city recital next month," the teacher said. "They're inviting young performers from different schools. I recommended you." He blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Yes," the teacher replied calmly. "You." The word felt heavy in the air. He walked home that day with a mix of excitement and fear. Winning at school had been one thing. Performing outside, in front of strangers from different places, felt bigger. When he told his foster mother, she placed her hand gently over his. "That's what happens when you don't give up," she said. Doors open. But that night, as he lay in bed, doubt quietly returned. What if the school competition had just been luck? What if the other students simply had a bad day? What if he couldn't repeat that performance somewhere else? He turned to the wall and stared into the darkness. The old fears were familiar. He had felt them before every change in his life. Every new home. Every new school. The fear of not being enough. The next day, instead of going straight to the main music hall, he walked back to practice room B. The upright piano was fully repaired now. The keys felt smooth and even. The sharp notes were gone. The heavy key no longer resisted. He sat down slowly and placed his hands on the keyboard. He didn't play the competition piece. Instead, he played something simple. Just slow chords, soft and steady. He listened to the sound carefully. Even though the piano was fixed, he found himself still pressing certain keys with more attention. His fingers remembered the old resistance. They remembered the work it had taken to control uneven tones. He realized something important in that quiet moment. The piano had changed, but he had changed more. Later that week, he stayed after school again, practicing for the upcoming recital. A younger student quietly entered the room and sat near the back wall. "Can I watch?" the student asked. He nodded. The younger student looked nervous, holding sheet music tightly in his hands. After he finished playing, the student spoke softly. "I'm scared to sign up for the next competition," he admitted. Why? He asked gently. What if people laugh? The question hung in the air. He knew that fear. He had felt it deeply. He leaned back slightly and answered honestly. Some people might, he said. But that doesn't decide how you play. The younger student looked confused. What decides then? You do, he replied. It wasn't a dramatic speech, just simple truth. That evening, he walked home thinking about how different things felt compared to the beginning of the year. Back then, he had been the one sitting quietly, unsure of his place. Now someone else was looking to him for courage. The city recital approached quickly. Unlike the school competition, there would be no familiar faces in the audience. No classmates. No known teachers. Just strangers. On the day of the recital, he wore the same blazer he had worn at school. It still fit slightly loose at the sleeves. He didn't mind anymore. Backstage at the recital hall, performers from different schools warmed up quietly. Some looked confident. Others paced nervously. He sat on a small chair and closed his eyes. He didn't try to imagine applause. He didn't imagine trophies. He remembered the small practice room. He remembered the fixed piano. He remembered choosing to stay. When his name was called, he walked onto the unfamiliar stage calmly. The piano was different from the one at school. Slightly lighter in touch. A different sound. But he did not panic. He adjusted. The first note rang out clearly. The audience listened. He focused on the story within the music, not on impressing anyone. The difficult sections felt manageable now. He no longer rushed them. He no longer feared mistakes. He played with the same honesty he had discovered weeks earlier. When he finished, the applause was warm. He did not win first place that evening. He placed second. And strangely, he felt just as proud. On the ride home, his foster mother asked gently, "Are you disappointed?" He shook his head. "No," he said honestly. "I played the way I wanted to." That answer meant more than a trophy. Back at school the following week, he shared the experience with the music teacher. "You didn't win?" the teacher asked. "Second," he replied. The teacher smiled. And it felt good." The teacher nodded approvingly. Growth was no longer measured by winning alone. It was measured by confidence. By steadiness. By the ability to walk into unfamiliar rooms without shrinking. As winter slowly turned into early spring, he noticed another change within himself. He no longer avoided eye contact in hallways. He walked normally, not carefully. He still wasn't loud or attention-seeking. That wasn't who he was. But he was no longer trying to disappear. One afternoon, he stood alone in the music hall after practice. The grand piano sat under the soft ceiling lights. He walked toward it slowly and ran his fingers across the smooth surface. He thought about how this journey had started. With whispers. With a fixed piano. With quiet doubt. If someone had told him back then that he would feel this calm now, he might not have believed it. But here he was. Stronger, not because life had become easier, but because he had faced difficulty and grown through it. Before leaving the hall, he sat down one last time and played a soft melody. Not for a competition. Not for an audience. Just for himself. The notes filled the empty room gently. There was no pressure. No expectations. Only music. And for the first time in a long while, he realized something simple but powerful. He no longer played to prove he belonged. He played because he loved it. That difference changed everything. Spring settled over the school quietly. The trees near the entrance began to bloom, and the cold air slowly softened. From the outside, everything looked the same as it always had. Students rushed to class. Teachers carried stacks of papers. Laughter echoed through the hallways. But inside him, something steady had taken root. He was no longer walking through the building like a visitor. He no longer felt like someone who had to earn permission to stand where he stood. The feeling was not loud or dramatic. It was calm, quiet, solid. One afternoon, a notice was posted outside the music hall. The school would be hosting a small community concert. Not a competition this time. Just an evening where students could perform for families and local guests. Anyone could volunteer. He stood in front of the sign for a long moment. Months ago, he might have hesitated. Now, he simply wrote his name. The concert would not offer trophies. There would be no judges, no rankings, just music. As he prepared for it, he chose a different piece than the one that had won the competition. This one was softer, slower. It did not demand applause. It invited listening. During practice, a few students occasionally joined him in the music hall. Sometimes they asked for help. Sometimes they just listened quietly. The space felt different now, lighter. One day, the younger student who had once been afraid to sign up for a competition approached him again. "I signed up," the younger student said nervously. "For what?" "The summer recital." He smiled. "That's good. I'm still scared." "That's normal," he replied. "Just don't let it decide for you." The younger student nodded slowly, as if holding on to those words. That evening, when he returned home, his foster mother was sitting by the window with a small notebook in her hand. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Just thoughts," she said softly. "About how proud I am." He felt his face warm. "You don't have to write that down," he said with a shy smile. "I do," she replied, "because I want to remember this time." He understood. Life had not always given him stable moments. There had been moving boxes, unpacked suitcases, new rooms that did not yet feel like home. But this felt steady. The night of the community concert arrived gently. The auditorium was not as crowded as during the big competition, but it felt warmer somehow. Families chatted quietly. Small children shifted in their seats. He waited backstage, but this time there was no tightness in his chest. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage without overthinking each step. The grand piano stood in the center, familiar now. He sat down, adjusted the bench slightly, and began. The opening notes were soft and simple. The melody moved like a quiet conversation. It did not try to impress. It tried to connect. As he played, he noticed something new. He was not worried about mistakes. He was not listening for judgment. He was simply present. Each note felt honest. When he reached the middle section where the music swelled slightly, he allowed it to grow naturally. He did not push. He did not rush. The audience listened carefully. In the front row, he saw his foster mother watching with calm pride. Not tears this time, just steady joy. When the final note faded, the applause was gentle but sincere. He stood and bowed lightly. Backstage, he did not feel the rush of relief that had followed the competition months earlier. Instead, he felt peace. After the concert, families gathered in small groups near the stage. Conversations mixed with soft laughter. The school principal approached him. "You've grown a lot this year," the principal said. He nodded politely. "Not just as a musician," the principal continued, "but as a person." He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he simply said, "Thank you." As the crowd slowly left, he walked back into the empty auditorium one last time. The chairs were half folded. The lights were dimmed. He walked toward the piano and placed his hand on it gently. He thought about the beginning of the year, the iron gates, the whispers, the fixed piano in the small practice room. He remembered sitting there alone, pressing stiff keys, wondering if he belonged. If someone had told him then that he would one day stand confidently on this stage, he might not have believed it. But the journey had not been about proving others wrong. It had been about proving to himself that he could adapt, endure, and grow. A few days later, the school year began to close. Exams finished. Lockers emptied. The air felt lighter. On the final day, the music teacher called him into the classroom after everyone else had left. "There's something for you," the teacher said, handing him a small envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation for an advanced summer music program. "You earned it," the teacher said simply. He held the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of possibility inside it. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his foster mother and showed her the letter. She read it slowly, then looked up with shining eyes. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. He smiled softly. For the first time in his life, the future did not feel uncertain in a frightening way. It felt open. Before going to bed that night, he took one last look at the trophy on the shelf. The sunlight had faded, and the room was dim. He realized something important. The trophy had once felt like the symbol of his victory, but now it was simply a reminder. The real victory had happened in the quiet moments no one saw. In the small practice room with the uneven piano. In the choice not to quit. In the decision to respond with patience instead of anger. In learning to play beautifully even when the instrument was flawed. As he lay down, he felt gratitude more than pride. Gratitude for the challenges. Gratitude for the people who believed in him. Gratitude for the music that never asked where he came from. The next chapter of his life would bring new rooms, new stages, new pianos. Some would be perfect. Some would not. But he no longer feared that, because now he understood something simple and powerful. Even if life handed him another fixed piano, he knew exactly what to do. He would sit down. He would listen carefully. And he would play anyway.